Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on a topic that honestly lives right at that crossroads of incredible drive and sometimes just agonizing internal struggle. We're talking about the relentless, often exhausting search for perfection.
Absolutely. And we know so many people listening, maybe you listening right now, are high performers.
Yeah.
You're driven. You want the roadmap, the definitive answer, right? That 100% foolproof solution to silence that inner critic, get that final perfect outcome that feels like it will make all the effort worthwhile.
Yeah, that feeling of, if I just get this right, then I'll be okay.
But here's the core paradox we really need to unpack today. That very quest for the perfect cure, that 100% solution, is so often the biggest obstacle to actually feeling better, to healing.
So our mission then in this deep dive is to kind of untangle that.
It's really to unpack this whole complex psychological landscape and do it with, well, clinical precision. Because we absolutely have to distinguish between, healthy adaptive striving, which, let's face it, you need for success, and this other territory. The really problematic zone of what we call perfectionistic concerns.
Okay, and what does that look like? Perfectionistic concerns.
That's where you see this debilitating worry about making any mistake, and this really deep-seated belief that everyone around you, your boss, your family, maybe even society, demands absolute flawlessness. There's no room for error.
And we're not just talking about, being a bit type A or liking things neat here. This goes deeper.
Oh, much, much deeper. This problematic, rigid drive, it's actually a massive vulnerability factor. We have solid longitudinal research confirming this.
Yeah?
This kind of pathological perfectionism is a significant predictor for eventually developing obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD.
Wow.
So, the person trapped in this loop isn't experiencing some kind of moral failing. They're caught in a really vicious, self-sustaining psychological cycle. The very attempt to control their inner world, to make it perfect, paradoxically, just increases their feeling of being out of control.
So where do we start untangling this? It feels like we need some clear definitions first.
Exactly. We have to lay down the clinical foundation because the terms we use, OCD and OCPD, get thrown around constantly in everyday conversation, often completely inaccurately.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack the distinction right now because you're right. They sound almost identical to someone who hasn't studied them, but you're saying they're fundamentally different. Obsessive compulsive disorder versus obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Getting this distinction clear is absolutely crucial. It changes everything about how we understand the person's suffering and how we approach treatment. Let's start with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. So OCD is classified as an anxiety-related disorder. It's fundamentally defined by the presence of obsessions. Now, obsessions aren't just worries. They are recurrent, persistent thoughts, urges, or images that feel intrusive. They barge into your mind unwanted, and they cause marked anxiety or distress.
Intrusive is the key word there, right? They feel like they come from outside, almost.
Or at least they feel profoundly alien to the self. The person actively tries to ignore them, suppress them, or neutralize them with some other thought or action, which of course, try not to think about something usually just makes you think about it more.
The pink elephant problem.
Exactly. And here's the critical psychological feature you hinted at. The person experiences the obsession as something foreign, terrifying, and fundamentally not them.
Okay, so it clashes with their own values or self-image.
Precisely. The key term here is ego-dystonic. The thoughts, the feelings, sometimes even the resulting behaviors are experienced as being in direct conflict with the person's sense of self, their core values. If you're a deeply religious person, you might be tormented by blasphemous thoughts. If you're a loving parent, you might have horrific intrusive images about harming your child.
That sounds absolutely terrifying, to have your own mind feel like the enemy.
It is. The person feels terrorized by their own mental content. And importantly, often on some level, they recognize that the thoughts are irrational or excessive, or at least highly unlikely, but they're completely driven by the intense anxiety those thoughts produce. The feeling is unbearable.
So the obsession creates the anxiety, and then comes the compulsion. That's the attempt to get rid of the anxiety.
That's the function, yes. Compulsions are those repetitive behaviors. Think checking, washing, ordering, arranging. Or they can be mental acts, like praying silently, counting, repeating words or phrases that the person feels driven to perform in response to an obsession. They often follow very rigid, self-imposed rules.
And the goal is to reduce the distress or prevent some dreaded event.
Correct. They are desperate attempts to neutralize that initial anxiety spike or to prevent some feared outcome associated with the obsession. But clinically, when we observe these compulsions, they are often clearly excessive, or they're not connected in any realistic way to what they're designed to prevent, like tapping a doorway 3 times to prevent a plane crash. The person with OCD is fundamentally fighting a horrible feeling or thought they despise. It feels alien.
Okay, that's clear. Ego-Dystonic. The thoughts are bad, unwelcome invaders. Now, let's pivot to the other one. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD. This is the one people often confuse with just being, super organized or a neat freak.
Right, and that's a huge misunderstanding. OCPD is fundamentally different because it's not an anxiety disorder centered on specific obsessions and compulsions. It's a pervasive, lifelong personality disorder. It's baked into the very fabric of how the person sees the world and themselves.
Okay, so what defines it then?
It's marked by this unwavering preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, details, rules, lists, and achieving mental and interpersonal control, often to the point where flexibility, openness, and efficiency are lost.
So the pursuit of control actually makes them less effective.
Often, yes. And here's the absolute crucial difference. The key term for OCPD is Ego-Syntonic.
Syntonic, meaning?
Meaning the individual sees their perfectionistic thoughts, their rigid behaviors, their excessive devotion to rules and work as rational, purposeful, and entirely aligned with their deepest self-concept. They don't see their rigidity as a problem. They often see it as a strength, a virtue even, their moral high ground.
Wow, the distress doesn't come from having a horrible, intrusive thought like an OCD, like, did I contaminate my family?
Exactly. The distress in OCPD typically comes not from the thought itself, but when the external world, messy reality, imperfect colleagues, unpredictable life, fails to meet their incredibly rigid internal standards.
So give me an example.
Okay, the person with OCPD isn't usually tormented by an unwanted, intrusive thought about, say, harming someone. They are genuinely distressed, maybe even enraged, because they spent 4 hours meticulously formatting a report to meet exact company guidelines down to the font size and the footnotes, only for a subordinate to submit a related document using the wrong template or, a slightly different shade of blue on a chart.
So the imperfection is the source of the distress, not a scary thought.
Precisely. They don't feel tormented by the idea of perfection. They feel validated by it. The only suffering comes when reality, or other people, inevitably fails to adhere to their impossibly high, rigid code. They might think, why can't everyone else just do things the right way?
This sounds like it could be that classic burnout boss profile, someone so excessively devoted to productivity and detail that they actually interfere with getting things done because nothing is ever good enough, and they can't delegate because no one else meets their standard.
That can certainly be one manifestation, yes. The inability to delegate is huge.
Right.
Or missing deadlines because they're stuck perfecting minor details.
But hang on, if they truly believe their rigidity is a virtue, if it's ego-syntonic, why would they ever seek help? Why are they listening to this deep dive? How do you even get someone with OCPD into therapy?
That is an excellent and very practical question. That ego-syntonic nature creates a profound barrier to seeking help, let alone healing. Because the very idea of embracing messiness or settling for good enough feels inherently wrong to them. It can feel irresponsible, lazy, even morally reprehensible.
So they don't walk in saying, my perfectionism is ruining my life.
Rarely, if ever. They typically come in because their relationships are falling apart, their spouse is threatening to leave, their kids feel constantly criticized, or they've been given an ultimatum at work because their inflexibility, their inability to delegate, or their chronic deadline missing has finally become catastrophic for the team or the company. The consequences bring them in, not the internal belief system itself.
So the therapist's job initially is to help them see the downside of their strength.
Exactly. We have to gently, carefully help them build insight that their perceived strength, their rigid adherence to standards, has actually become their greatest weakness. It's preventing them from connecting with others, from being flexible, from actually completing their core tasks effectively, or from experiencing joy. It's a tough sell initially.
That insight seems absolutely vital, and it connects back to this idea of perfectionism as maybe a cognitive vulnerability factor that might underpin both conditions, or at least relate to them. If we zoom out now to the cognitive foundation, why does the mind get trapped in these obsessive or perfectionistic loops? You mentioned it's built on systematic errors in thinking.
Yes, the obsessive perfectionistic mind isn't just randomly malfunctioning. It's often operating based on a set of systematic cognitive distortions or thinking errors that actively maintain and even escalate the distress. It's like the software has bugs that reinforce the problem. Understanding these is key to seeing the internal battle the perfectionist faces daily.
Okay, let's identify some of these core distortions. What's driving the cycle?
Well, the first one, which connects right back to that desire for the 100% solution you mentioned at the start, is this devastating combination of perfectionism itself, coupled with an extreme intolerance of uncertainty.
Intolerance of uncertainty, meaning any doubt is unbearable.
Exactly. The obsessive or perfectionistic mind demands 100% certainty, 100% safety, 100% correctness. Any possibility of doubt, any tiny chance, even a 0.0001% chance of a negative outcome, a mistake, or ambiguity, feels completely intolerable. It generates massive anxiety. This intolerance is often one of the very first things we look for clinically. Can this person sit with not knowing?
And once that tiny sliver of doubt creeps in, I imagine other distortions kick in to magnify it.
Absolutely. The next big one is overestimation of threat. The mind doesn't just register a potential risk. It leaps to the conclusion that the feared outcome is not only catastrophic, like this typo will get me fired, this germ will cause a deadly illness, but also highly probable. The perceived likelihood of disaster is way out of proportion to objective reality. The mind is constantly running emergency drills for even the smallest ambiguities.
Constantly on high alert, that sounds exhausting.
It is, and this is often paired, especially in high achievers, with inflated responsibility. This one probably resonates deeply if you're a professional listener. It's this exaggerated, crushing belief that you are solely or primarily responsible for causing or preventing negative outcomes that are often far outside your actual control.
Like thinking, if this team project fails, it's entirely my fault because I didn't personally double-check every single line of code or every reference in the report 17 times.
Precisely that. It's this delusion of pervasive control, and it puts the weight of the entire world, or at least the entire project or family's well-being, squarely onto the perfectionist's shoulders. Any negative outcome feels like a personal failure of vigilance.
That weight must be absolutely crushing. But you mentioned there's one more that's particularly critical, especially for linking OCD to this perfectionistic urge.
Yes, perhaps the most insidious cognitive error, particularly relevant for understanding the distress in OCD, but also fueling perfectionistic avoidance, is thought-action fusion, or TAF.
Thought-action fusion, what does that mean?
This is a metacognitive error. An error is in thinking about thinking that completely warps your relationship with your own mind. TIA comes in two main flavors. Moral tave is the belief that simply having an unwanted, bad, or harmful thought, like an aggressive or sexual or blasphemous thought, is morally equivalent to actually acting on it. So thinking it makes you a bad person.
Wow, so the thought itself feels like a transgression.
Yes. And the second flavor is likelihood TAF, which is the belief that having a thought about an unwanted event increases the actual probability of that event occurring. Like, if I think about my house burning down, I've somehow made it more likely to happen, so I must suppress or neutralize that thought immediately.
I can see how that would drive a desperate need to control your own thoughts.
It absolutely does. It drives this futile, exhausting need to police and control the random, chaotic, often nonsensical stream of consciousness that is just part of being human. If thinking a bad thought is as bad as doing it, or makes it more likely, then you feel you must achieve perfect purity of thought.
And that right there feels like the absolute core problem we keep circling back to. The perfectionist's mind ends up experiencing its own internal world, its random noise, its dark thoughts, its anxieties, its stream of consciousness, as if it were a genuine external threat that must be controlled, policed, and purified.
Beautifully put, yes. Their perfectionism, the endless checking, the ordering, the reviewing, the mental rituals becomes this desperate, exhausting, and ultimately doomed attempt to control and perfect this internal chaos. They're trying to achieve 100% certainty, 100% purity of mind, which is simply impossible. The fundamental relationship with thought itself is broken.
Okay, so if that relationship is broken, if trying to debate or control the thoughts directly is part of the problem, then the treatment needs this different approach, right? It can't just be about talking about it or trying to think your way out.
Exactly. And because that fundamental relationship is broken, especially in the case of full-blown OCD, we must immediately pivot to the treatments that tackle the behavior and the perception of the thoughts, not just engaging in more intellectual debate. When people come looking for therapy for OCD, we have to be incredibly clear. Traditional insight-oriented talk therapy, where you just explore feelings in childhood, is generally not effective as a primary treatment.
So what's the go-to?
The undisputed clinical gold standard, the first-line psychotherapeutic treatment with the most robust evidence base, is a highly specific form of behavioral therapy, exposure and response prevention, or ERP.
ERP. Okay, I've heard of this. It sounds intense.
It can be, yes.
Yeah.
But it's powerful precisely because it's structured and systematic. It essentially forces a change of behavior, and often the thoughts and feelings eventually follow that change. It directly targets the core engine of OCD.
And it's built on two core components, as the name suggests, exposure and response prevention.
That's right. Let's break it down. First, you have exposure. This involves the patient systematically, gradually, and repeatedly confronting the triggers, the thoughts, images, objects, situations, or even internal sensations that reliably spark their obsessional anxiety.
Okay, so leaning into the fear, not avoiding it.
Exactly. And the second absolutely crucial half is response prevention, or RP. This means the patient makes a conscious, deliberate choice not to perform their usual compulsive ritual, whether that's a physical behavior like washing or checking, or a mental ritual like neutralizing thoughts or seeking reassurance after the obsession has been triggered by the exposure.
So you face the trigger, feel the anxiety spike, and then actively resist the urge to do the thing that usually makes it feel better temporarily.
Precisely. The therapist and patient work together to create what's called an exposure hierarchy. It's a list of feared situations or triggers, ranked by how much distress they cause, maybe on a scale from 0 to 100, like a SEDS scale, subjective units of distress. And you don't start with the scariest thing. You start tackling items lower down, maybe in the 30-50 range, building confidence and tolerance as you go. You're deliberately activating the fear, but in a controlled, planned way.
What do these exposures actually look like in practice? Are we talking about touching dirty things?
That's definitely one type, yes. We talk about in vivo exposure, which means confronting the trigger in the real world, in real life. So, for someone with contamination fears, that might indeed be touching a public doorknob, then maybe touching their face or eating something without washing their hands first, and resisting the urge to wash for a set period.
Okay. What about other types of OCD, like checking?
For checking compulsions, it could be locking the door and leaving the house after checking only once, resisting the urge to go back and check again, or sending an important email after proofreading it only once. For someone with ordering or symmetry compulsions, it might be intentionally messing up items on their desk and leaving them that way.
But what about people whose obsessions are purely mental, like horrific thoughts without an obvious physical compulsion, pure O, as it's sometimes called?
Great question. ERP absolutely applies there too, but the exposure is different. For those with primarily obsessional OCD, we use imaginal exposure. Here, the patient vividly imagines their feared scenario. Maybe it's a fear of losing control and shouting something offensive in public or causing an accident through negligence. They might write out a detailed script of this feared scenario and then listen to an audio recording of it repeatedly.
Wow, listening to your worst fear on loop.
Yes, and the crucial response prevention part there is resisting any accompanying mental rituals, like mentally reviewing their intentions to prove they didn't mean to think the bad thought, or praying for forgiveness, or trying to replace the bad thought with a good one. They just sit with the anxiety the imaginal script provokes.
And you mentioned internal sensations too.
Right, for people whose obsessions are triggered by physical sensations, maybe panic symptoms, or other bodily feelings they misinterpret as dangerous, we use interoceptive exposure. This involves deliberately inducing those harmless physical sensations. For example, spinning in a chair to feel dizzy, breathing through a thin straw to feel short of breath, or tensing muscles to feel tension. The goal is to learn through direct experience that these sensations themselves are not dangerous and don't need a compulsive escape.
This sounds incredibly challenging, and I can imagine it's especially tough for the perfectionist listener, the one whose core issue might be that intense feeling that something is not just right, that NJR feeling, as it's sometimes called in the field. How does ERP specifically target that need for perfect balance, perfect completion, perfect feeling?
You've hit on a really key subtype, sometimes called just right OCD or perfectionism. For these individuals, ERP has to be designed to intentionally create imperfection, to directly challenge that need for things to feel perfectly complete or balanced. The patient is deliberately exposed to that visceral, deeply uncomfortable feeling of wrongness or incompleteness, and the response prevention is tolerating that feeling without fixing it.
So concrete examples for that.
Think about deliberately misaligning books on a shelf and leaving them there for hours, or wearing socks that are slightly different textures or colors, or eating off a plate that has a tiny, barely noticeable chip, tying one shoelace slightly tighter than the other, reading a paragraph and intentionally stopping mid-sentence. We are purposefully creating that not quite right feeling and asking them to sit with it.
That sounds maddening if that's your core trigger. What about for the professional perfectionist, the one whose domain is work? The corporate version of this must be brutal.
Absolutely. And often the most relevant and therefore most powerful Exposures for the high-achieving perfectionist involve their work product. The classic example is completing an important task. Let's say it's a complex financial model, a critical report, or a high-stakes presentation, but only completing it to a 90% good enough standard.
Only 90%, I can feel some listeners squirming already.
Exactly. And then the absolute critical part, submitting it.
Yeah.
Hitting send on that email, turning in that report, delivering that presentation, while actively resisting the overwhelming urge to do one more review, one more tweak, check that final slide deck just one more dozen times.
So they send the email knowing there might be a typo or the formatting isn't absolutely perfect.
Yes. And then the response prevention is sitting with the ensuing anxiety, the what-ifs, the catastrophic predictions, without engaging in checking behaviors, like repeatedly checking their sent mail to confirm it went through okay, or asking colleagues for reassurance that it was fine, or starting preemptive damage control. They just tolerate the uncertainty.
Yeah. That response prevention piece, just sitting with the discomfort and the uncertainty, knowing the email might have a flaw, that's what actually retrains the brain, right? But maybe not in the way people originally thought. It's not just about waiting for the anxiety to magically disappear.
Precisely. You've nailed a really important evolution in our understanding of how ERP works. The older model, which you still hear sometimes, talked about habituation. The idea was that if you just stayed in the feared situation long enough without performing the compulsion, your anxiety would naturally decrease over time, like getting used to cold water.
Okay, habituation. Makes intuitive sense.
It does, but it doesn't fully capture what's happening, and it can set up unrealistic expectations, especially for perfectionists who are waiting for that 100% anxiety-free state. The more modern and I think more accurate and helpful view is based on inhibitory learning.
Inhibitory learning. Okay, what's the difference?
The core idea of inhibitory learning is that ERP doesn't necessarily work by erasing the original fear memory. That fear association, touching doorknobs is dangerous or making a mistake is catastrophic, might always be there to some extent. Instead, ERP works by helping the brain create a new, parallel safety memory that learns to inhibit the expression of the old fear memory in specific contexts.
So you're not deleting the fear file, you're writing a new file that says this situation is actually safe, and that new file becomes stronger over time.
That's a great way to put it. You're building competing evidence. The mechanism hinges on what's called prediction error or expectancy violation. When you deliberately do the exposure, touch the doorknob, and then resist the compulsion, don't wash your hands, the catastrophic outcome you predicted, getting sick, contaminating everything, doesn't actually happen.
Your brain registers, I expected disaster, but disaster didn't occur.
Exactly. Prediction error detected. This mismatch between expectation and reality is crucial learning information. It doesn't necessarily extinguish the old fear instantly, but it allows for the formation of this new inhibitory memory. Okay, in this context, touching this doorknob and not washing didn't lead to catastrophe. Maybe it's safer than I thought. The more you violate the expectancy, the stronger that new safety learning becomes.
So success in ERP is completely redefined then. It's not about achieving a state of zero anxiety, which is the perfectionist's trap again.
Absolutely not. Success is redefined as the willingness to experience anxiety and uncertainty, to tolerate discomfort, while still engaging in meaningful activities and refraining from compulsions. It's about learning that you can handle the anxiety, that the feared outcome doesn't happen, and that you can function even while feeling anxious. It's about reclaiming your life from the anxiety, not eliminating the feeling entirely.
That sounds like probably the hardest but also the bravest thing a person caught in this cycle can do. It requires immense courage.
It truly does. ERP is hard work. But this is where we often hit a really dangerous misunderstanding, particularly when we start talking about the cognitive components of therapy. Because standard cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is so effective for many other issues like depression or generalized anxiety, well, it can be seriously misapplied when it comes to OCD.
Okay, this is a critical point. You're saying the standard CBT techniques like challenging negative thoughts might actually backfire with OCD?
Yeah, absolutely can, yes.
Look.
Let's be clear. Standard cognitive restructuring, the kind where you use thought records, identify cognitive distortions like all or nothing thinking, and actively debate the validity of negative thoughts, works wonders for non-OCD perfectionism or generalized anxiety or depression. We call it CBTP when tailored for perfectionism. It helps people develop more balanced perspectives.
But not for OCD. Why the difference?
Because for the person with OCD, the problem itself often involves excessive rumination, internal debate, and attempts to mentally neutralize or solve the intrusive thought. Their mind is already hosting this constant, agonizing inner debate tournament. They're already trying desperately to challenge, disprove, or argue with the obsession.
So asking them to do more challenging of the thought is like pouring gasoline on the fire.
Precisely. If a well-meaning but untrained therapist asks a patient with OCD, okay, let's examine the evidence for and against your intrusive thought that you might be a terrible person, the patient doesn't usually achieve helpful cognitive distance or insight. Instead, they often latch on to that challenge as a new mental compulsion. It becomes another form of reassurance seeking, another analytical ritual. They get stuck analyzing the evidence, trying to reach that elusive 100% certainty that the thought isn't true. The OCD itself validates the idea that the thought must be engaged with, analyzed, debated, and ultimately neutralized to achieve safety. The patient often knows logically the fear is improbable. They can list the evidence against it. But the problem is their profound intolerance of that remaining 0.1% of doubt, or the sheer feeling the obsession generates.
Okay, so standard thought challenging feeds the beast. What is the correct cognitive approach then? What cognitive work actually helps alongside ERP?
The cognitive work that complements ERP effectively needs to shift the focus. Instead of challenging the content of the obsession, is this thought true? We challenge the process. We challenge the beliefs about the thought or the rationale for the compulsion.
Can you give an example?
Sure, instead of debating, am I actually contaminated? We might challenge the belief that I must be 100% certain I'm not contaminated before I can relax, or this feeling of anxiety is unbearable and will last forever if I don't wash, or having this thought means I'm irresponsible. We target the intolerance of uncertainty or the overestimation of threat related to the feeling itself, or the thought-action fusion. We challenge the rules the OCD imposes.
So it's metacognitive thinking about the thinking process, not getting lost in the content, and maybe introducing some distance, some absurdity, because these thoughts and rules often feel so deadly serious to the person experiencing them.
Exactly. Introducing distance and undermining the perceived seriousness and authority of the obsessive thoughts or the perfectionistic rules is key. We absolutely need to help people externalize that rigid, demanding inner critic and see it for what it is, often repetitive, unhelpful mental noise rather than unquestionable truth. Making it ridiculous can be incredibly powerful.
Okay, this feels like the perfect time to bring in that role play, that technique to externalize the critic. Let's use the sergeant should idea to make that demanding inner voice seem less like a five-star general and more like, well, a slightly absurd character.
Let's do it. Okay, imagine someone, maybe one of our high-achieving listeners, frozen. It's 2 a.m., they're in front of their laptop, unable to send a really important executive summary they've already spent hours on. Why? Because they're convinced their entire career hinges on correcting some incredibly minor inconsistency they noticed in the footnotes on page 17.
Okay, I can picture it. Total paralysis. He's standing there, probably bolt upright, hands hovering over the keyboard, maybe sweating a little, and the thoughts are racing. This summary should be absolutely perfect. I must get this right. There can be no mistakes. I must not fail on this one tiny detail. If that footnote looks lazy or inaccurate, they'll assume the main financial projections are lazy too. My credibility is on the line. I must reread the entire source document for the footnote policy again, just to be sure, for the fourth time.
Whoa, hang on. Stop right there. Who is that talking? Because that voice sounds incredibly aggressive, rigid, and frankly, very, very demanding. That doesn't sound like you, the capable professional. That sounds
like, well, it sounds like Sergeant Should has stormed into the room and started barking orders.
Sergeant Should?
Yeah, he's all about the shoulds, the musts, the have-tos. He's got this whole list of inflexible rules. And let's be honest, Sergeant Should needs a serious demotion. He's just a guy, a very loud, very boring, very repetitive guy, constantly yelling these commands inside your head. And right now, you're listening to him like he's a five-star general who possesses some secret, vital intelligence about footnote formatting.
Okay, Sergeant Should.
Tell Sergeant Should he's completely out of uniform, his tactics are outdated, his advice is, frankly, incredibly repetitive and unhelpful at 2 a.m.
Trying to play along but still feeling the pressure.
But I can't.
He feels right. If the footnotes are wrong, it does reflect badly. He has a list of rules, important rules, that I must follow to maintain standards. Oh, he has a list of rules, does he? Is he actually holding a clipboard right now? Can you see him? Is he wearing little sergeant stripes on his mental shoulders? Because honestly, he sounds exhausting. Why on earth would you take strategic career advice from a guy whose entire vocabulary consists of must, should, and perfect? That is the most boring, uncreative, and frankly unhelpful advice in the entire world. You already know the standards. You're way smarter and more nuanced than Sergeant should. He's just noise.
Starts to break character, letting out a genuine laugh. Okay, okay. Sergeant Should is. He's a terrible strategist. He's just a repetitive, anxious mental voice, and I'm letting him run the entire operation into the ground at 2 a.m. over a footnote. That's actually pretty funny when you frame it like that.
Right. The moment you give that rigid, critical voice a slightly ridiculous character, the moment you see the absurdity of taking orders from Sergeant Should, it creates distance. It loosens the grip. It stops feeling like your voice, like ultimate truth, and starts feeling like an annoying, overbearing character you don't actually have to obey.
That distance is powerful. It feels like it creates space to breathe. But as you pointed out earlier, for people really struggling with that intense, not just right feeling or profound self-criticism, that internal feeling of wrongness or anxiety during ERP can still feel absolutely overwhelming, almost impossible to bear, even if they see the absurdity.
That's a critical point. When the threat system is just firing on all cylinders, when the shame or anxiety is overwhelming, simply trying to white-knuckle through ERP can feel impossible and might even backfire. We need an approach that helps change the relationship with those intense internal experiences. And this is precisely what led to the development of the so-called third-wave behavioral therapies.
Okay, third wave. This is where therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, come in, right?
Exactly. ACT, pronounced as the word ACT, emerged partly in response to the challenges some people faced with traditional CBT and even standard ERP, especially those highly self-critical perfectionists or those whose mental rigidity was just incredibly high. The goal in ACT shifts quite profoundly. It's less about eliminating unwanted thoughts and feelings and more about changing your relationship to them so they have less impact and influence over your behavior. The ultimate aim is cultivating psychological flexibility.
Psychological flexibility, what does that mean in practice?
It means being able to contact the present moment fully, as a conscious human being, and based on what the situation affords, persisting with or changing your behavior in the service of your chosen values, even when difficult thoughts, feelings, and sensations are present. It's about opening up to your experience and doing what matters.
Okay, so how does ACT achieve that? You mentioned it provides an antidote to that CBT pitfall of debating the thoughts.
It does, through its first core process, cognitive diffusion. Diffusion is the direct counterpoint to cognitive restructuring or challenging thoughts. Instead of getting entangled with a thought, debating it, analyzing it, trying to make it go away, diffusion techniques help you unhook from the thought. They help you step back and see thoughts for what they are. Just words, images, bits of language passing through your mind, not literal truths, not direct commands, not objective reality, and not necessarily threats that require immediate action.
So, seeing thoughts as thoughts, not facts. How do you do that?
ACT offers a whole toolkit of diffusion techniques. One simple one is just labeling the process of thinking. So instead of getting caught up in, I am a failure, which is fusion, you are the thought. You step back and observe, I am having the thought that I'm a failure. Or even shorter, just noticing thinking. That tiny bit of linguistic framing creates immense distance between you, the observer, and the thought, the content passing through.
Just adding, I'm having the thought. That creates space. What else?
There are dozens. You can thank your mind for its input, like, thanks mind, for that failure story, noted. You can visualize thoughts as leaves floating down a stream or clouds passing in the sky, or words written on banners pulled by airplanes. You just watch them come and go without grabbing onto them. You can put the thought on a tiny mental billboard and watch it drive by. But perhaps the most powerful way, especially for those heavy, serious, perfectionistic thoughts, is to undermine their seriousness directly using techniques like the silly voice technique.
Okay, like Sergeant Should, but maybe applied differently.
Similar principle, yes. When an obsessive or highly self-critical thought feels incredibly serious, heavy, and believable, making it sound utterly ridiculous strips it of its perceived power and urgency. It breaks the fusion by highlighting its nature as just sound.
Okay, let's try it. Back to our high achiever, staring at the footnote, paralyzed. They're completely fused with the thought.
Right. They're thinking deep down, maybe not even in full sentences, but feeling it intensely. I am a worthless disaster. If I hit send on this email with even a tiny flaw, I'll be exposed, humiliated, maybe fired. I must fix this kerning, this reference, this everything. The thought feels heavy, serious, full of impending doom.
Okay, I'm channeling that. Sitting here, feeling that weight, internalizing, I am a worthless disaster. It feels bad. Very real.
Okay, now that thought is currently operating with the dramatic weight of, like, a Shakespearean tragedy, right? We need to turn it into a ridiculous cartoon. So try taking that exact phrase, I am a worthless disaster, and singing it. Sing it to the tune of Happy Birthday. Go on.
Hesitates, then sings tentatively, slightly off-key. I am a worthless disaster. I am a worthless disaster. Starts to sound slightly absurd. I am a worthless disaster, dear me. I am a worthless disaster.
How does that feel? Does it still carry the same crushing weight when sung like that?
Chuckles. No, it sounds ridiculous. Like a really bad birthday song for Aori or something. It definitely lightens it.
Okay, let's try another one. Even better. Say the exact same phrase, I am a worthless disaster, but say it in the voice of a cartoon character. Maybe a really high-pitched, squeaky cartoon mouse, like Mickey Mouse or Alvin the Chipmunk. Really commit to the squeak.
Takes a breath, then in a high-pitched, frantic, squeaky voice, gosh, I am a W worthless D disaster.
Bursts out laughing genuinely and lets it sustain.
Okay, stop. You sound like you just got caught trying to steal a giant wheel of cheese and failed spectacularly. It is absolutely impossible to take the squeaky disaster mouse seriously as a statement of profound truth about your core identity.
Laughing too. No, you really can't. It just sounds completely absurd.
That involuntary laugh, that feeling of absurdity that is the moment the fusion breaks, the thought hasn't changed its content, but your relationship to it has completely shifted. It's no longer a serious, heavy truth demanding immediate compliance. It's just ridiculous internal mental noise. It's no longer you. It's just a sound pattern in your head. That's diffusion in action. That's incredibly powerful. Just changing the tone, the delivery, it completely shifts the emotional impact. But ACT isn't just diffusion, right? It's a whole model. You mentioned psychological flexibility involves other things too, like acceptance.
Absolutely. Diffusion helps you unhook from difficult thoughts. The second core process, often called acceptance or sometimes willingness, addresses the difficult feelings and sensations that come up. This is absolutely crucial for the perfectionist, especially with that just OCD feeling.
Acceptance, does that mean liking the anxiety or the feeling of wrongness?
Not at all. Acceptance in ACT isn't about liking or wanting the difficult feeling. It's not passive resignation, like throwing your hands up and saying, oh, well, I give up, I'll always feel anxious. It's the opposite. It's an active, courageous process of making room for uncomfortable internal experiences. The anxiety, the doubt, the urge, the physical tension, that feeling of wrongness without struggling with them, trying to suppress them or trying to make them go away before you can act.
So allowing the feeling to be there, like an uninvited guest you don't fight with while you keep doing what you need to do.
That's a good way to think about it. It's dropping the internal struggle with the feeling. You acknowledge its presence. Okay, anxiety is here, and you allow it to be there, noticing it with curiosity perhaps, as just a piece of internal weather, while you redirect your energy and attention towards taking actions that matter to you.
Okay, so diffusion deals with thoughts, acceptance deals with feelings and sensations. How does ACT connect this internal work back to actually living your life? You mentioned values and action.
Yes, those are the crucial orienting components. ACT uses 6 core processes that work together, often visualized as a hexagon, the hexaflex. We've covered diffusion and acceptance. There's also contacting the present moment, bringing awareness to your here and now experience, physically and environmentally, rather than being lost in past regrets or future worries.
Grounding yourself.
Exactly. Then there's self as context, which is fostering that observer self perspective. We touched on the idea that you are the stable container or the sky, in which thoughts, feelings, and sensations, the weather, appear and pass. You are not the weather itself. This provides a sense of continuity and perspective, even when the internal storm is raging.
That distinction, I am the observer, not the content, feels really liberating, especially if you identify strongly with your anxiety or perfectionism.
It's profoundly liberating. And then the final 2 processes provide the direction: values and committed action.
Values, like identifying what's truly important to you.
Precisely. ACT involves helping you clarify what deeply held qualities of action you want to embody, what truly matters to you in the big picture, things like connection, kindness, creativity, courage, contribution, learning. We ask the perfectionist, what values are you neglecting or sacrificing because you're stuck spending 4 hours perfecting footnotes or avoiding social situations for fear of judgment? Values provide the intrinsic motivation, the why behind the hard work of therapy. They become your compass.
So values give you the direction, the North Star.
Yes. A committed action is about taking concrete, overt behavioral steps that are consistent with those chosen values, even in the presence of difficult thoughts and feelings. And this is where ERP fits beautifully within the ACT framework.
So the ERP exposure itself becomes the committed action.
Exactly. That ERP task, which might have previously felt like meaningless, arbitrary torture, why am I touching this doorknob, is now reframed, becomes a committed action taken in service of a chosen value. You aren't just tolerating a messy desk, you are practicing willingness to tolerate uncertainty, acceptance, while seeing the thought, this must be perfect, as just a thought, diffusion, so that you can act in line with your value of, say, being present with your family after work, committed action towards values. You give the hard work meaning and purpose.
That reframe makes so much sense. It connects the dots between the internal skills and the external behavior change. This whole philosophical shift, moving from struggle to willingness, is really captured well by some of the metaphors used in ACT, isn't it? Many of them seem to have roots in older wisdom traditions, like Zen.
They absolutely do. The metaphors are powerful teaching tools because they bypass the literal analytical mind. Let's start with one of the most famous ACT metaphors, the tug-of-war metaphor. It brilliantly illustrates the futility of fighting with anxiety or difficult thoughts.
Okay, paint the picture.
Imagine you find yourself standing at the edge of a huge, bottomless chasm, and you're holding one end of a thick rope. On the other end of the rope, across the chasm, is this huge, ugly, powerful monster. Let's call it the monster of doubt or anxiety or perfectionism. And you are in a desperate tug-of-war with this monster.
Got it, pulling for dear life.
You're digging your heels in, straining every muscle, pouring all your energy into pulling that rope because you are absolutely convinced that if you let up even for a second, if you lose ground, that monster will pull you over the edge and into the abyss. You must win this fight.
And the perfectionist's instinct, or the anxious person's instinct, is always to pull harder, right? To find a better technique, analyze the monster's weaknesses, redouble the effort. But they're exhausted, they're sweating, they're not actually going anywhere, they're just stuck in this horrible struggle at the edge of the pit.
Exactly. They're pouring endless energy into the fight. But here's the counterintuitive truth the metaphor reveals. The monster, that force of doubt or anxiety, actually seems to enjoy the struggle. It feeds on your resistance. It gets stronger the harder you pull against it. The rope itself, the struggle, is the trap.
So what's the solution? You can't overpower the monster.
The solution isn't to find a magical way to pull harder or defeat the monster. The solution is terrifying, counterintuitive, but ultimately liberating. Drop the rope.
Just let go. But won't the monster pull you in?
That's the fear. But think about it. What happens when you suddenly stop pulling? All that force the monster was exerting against your pull suddenly has nothing to resist it. The monster often stumbles, maybe even collapses right there, under the weight of its own now unopposed effort. The pit wasn't necessarily between you and the monster. The real trap was the struggle itself, the rope. When you drop the rope, you free up all that energy you were wasting on the fight, and you can walk away from the edge. You stop feeding the monster with your struggle.
Wow. Dropping the rope? That's acceptance and diffusion in action. Stop fighting the internal experience.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the passengers on the bus metaphor? That one really helps explain moving forward with difficult thoughts, right? It clarifies that self as context and committed action piece.
It does beautifully. Imagine your life is like a bus, and you are the driver. Your values determine the direction you want to head, maybe towards Connection Station or Contribution City. Now, this bus is also full of passengers, and some of these passengers are, well, they're unruly, critical, and frankly, quite unpleasant.
Okay, who are these passengers?
They represent your unwanted thoughts, feelings, memories, and sensations.
Yeah.
You've got the "you're a fraud" passenger yelling criticisms from the back seat. You've got the anxious, something terrible will happen passenger constantly trying to grab the map and reroute you towards Safetyville. Maybe the "you're not good enough" passenger is sitting right behind you, whispering doubts in your ear. Maybe the feeling of dread passenger is just sitting there radiating gloom.
A noisy, difficult bunch. Sounds familiar.
Right. Now, the old way of dealing with these passengers, the struggle approach, is that every time one of them gets loud or tries to interfere, you, the driver, stop the bus. You turn around, maybe you go to the back, and you try to argue with the fraud passenger, trying to logically prove them wrong. Or you try to forcibly eject the anxiety passenger off the bus. Or you try to appease the not good enough passenger.
And what happens while you're back there arguing or wrestling with the passengers?
The bus isn't moving. You're stalled. You're stuck. You're spending all your energy dealing with the passengers, and you're not making any progress towards your chosen destination, towards what actually matters to you. You're letting the passengers dictate whether the bus moves or not.
So what's the ACT solution, the psychologically flexible way to drive the bus?
The ACT approach is to acknowledge the passengers are there. You don't have to like them. You don't have to believe what they say. You can hear the fraud passenger yelling. Maybe you even nod gently. There's the fraud story again. Noted. Thanks for sharing mine.
Right.
But you keep your hands firmly on the steering wheel, your eyes looking forward towards your valued direction, and you keep driving.
So you let them scream, criticize, offer dire predictions, whatever they want to do. But you remain in the driver's seat, choosing the direction based on your values.
Exactly. They can make as much noise as they want back there, but they can only stop the bus if you stop engaging with the driving and start engaging with them. Your job isn't to silence the passengers. Your job is to drive the bus towards what's important to you, even with the noise. That's committed action in the presence of difficult internal experiences.
These metaphors really bring it to life. And you mentioned the connection to Zen philosophy is quite strong here. How does that principle of non-attachment fit in?
It fits perfectly. In fact, some argue that ACT is essentially a modern behavioral translation of core Buddhist principles, particularly non-attachment and mindfulness. The Buddha taught, very simply, that clinging is the root of suffering.
Clinging, meaning holding on too tightly.
Holding on tightly to things we want, pushing away things we don't want, and clinging to a fixed idea of self. The perfectionistic or obsessive cycle is driven by this intense clinging to the desire for certainty, clinging to the need for relief from anxiety, clinging to the idea that the intrusive thought must be eliminated or controlled. This very clinging, this struggle against the present moment's experience, is what creates the suffering and fuels the compulsions.
So the solution in Zen terms is to stop clinging.
Yes, to cultivate non-attachment. To learn to stop treating your mind as a battleground where thoughts must be conquered or controlled. Instead, you learn through mindfulness and practices like diffusion to recognize thoughts, feelings, and sensations as simply passing phenomena, like sounds reaching the ear, or sights reaching the eye, or clouds passing in the sky. They arise, they stay for a while, and they pass away if you don't grasp onto them or fight with them. This is a perfect description of cognitive diffusion, seeing thoughts as mental events, not solid realities you need to fuse with.
Okay, this integrated approach, ERP for the behavior, ACT for the relationship with thoughts and feelings, feels incredibly comprehensive. But for the perfectionist, there's often that deep layer of shame or intense self-criticism that can still block progress, right? Even if they understand ACT, the inner critic might be too vicious. We need to build an emotional platform of safety first.
Absolutely. This is where another crucial third-wave therapy comes in, often integrated alongside ACT and ERP, especially for highly self-critical individuals. Compassion-focused therapy, or CFT.
Compassion-focused therapy, how does that fit?
CFT was developed by Paul Gilbert, specifically recognizing that for many people, particularly those with high levels of shame and self-criticism, which is rampant in perfectionism, the core issue isn't just anxiety, it's a deficit in self-compassion and an overactive self-attacking system. Any perceived mistake, any hint of imperfection isn't just met with anxiety, it's met with a brutal internal self-attack that can be paralyzing and deeply depressing.
CFT explains this using a model of emotional regulation systems in the brain, right?
Yes, a simplified but very useful model. It posits we have three main types of affect regulation systems. First, the threat system, designed to detect and respond to danger, fight, flight, freeze, submit. This system is associated with feelings like anxiety, anger, disgust, shame. Perfectionists often have this system chronically dialed way up.
Okay, threat system. What else?
Second, the drive system. Focus on pursuing resources, achieving goals, seeking rewards. This involves feelings like excitement, motivation, wanting, striving. High achievers and perfectionists usually have a very active drive system too. They're constantly pushing.
Threat and drive, both high. What's missing?
What's often underdeveloped or inhibited, especially by early life experiences or chronic stress, is a third system, the soothing affiliative system. This system is associated with feelings of safeness, calmness, contentment, connectedness, and care. It's linked to the parasympathetic nervous system and triggered by kindness, warmth, affiliation, and compassion, both received and given, including given to oneself.
So the perfectionist might be all threat and drive, but very little soothing, stuck in fight-strive mode.
Precisely. They lack that internal capacity to calm themselves down, to feel safe, or to offer themselves kindness when they inevitably stumble or feel distressed. CFT aims to deliberately activate and strengthen this underdeveloped soothing system to help balance the overactive threat and drive systems.
How does it do that?
Through several methods. A big part is psychoeducation, helping the person understand their tricky brain, how these systems evolved, why they get stuck in threat loops, and importantly, that it's not their fault. This understanding itself reduces shame. Then it involves specific compassionate mind training exercises.
Like what kind of exercises?
Things like developing a compassionate inner voice, practicing talking to yourself with warmth, kindness, and understanding, perhaps like you would talk to a friend. Using compassionate imagery, maybe imagining a perfectly compassionate figure offering you support. Cultivating compassionate feelings in the body, it's about intentionally generating experiences of safeness and soothing to counteract the constant threat activation.
And how does this CFT work integrate with ACT and ERP? It sounds like a crucial foundation.
It really is. You can think of CFT as providing the necessary emotional platform or climate change that makes the difficult work of ACT and ERP possible, especially for the highly self-critical patient. Remember how ERP requires activating the threat system by facing fears. If every time you feel anxious during exposure, your inner critic brutally attacks you for feeling anxious, you're never going to stick with ERP. It's just too punishing.
Right. The self-criticism adds a whole other layer of suffering on top of the anxiety.
Exactly. CFT helps by turning down the volume and hostility of that inner critic first. It helps build internal resources of safeness, courage, and self-kindness. This gives the person the emotional grounding, the resilience needed to tolerate the distress of sustained exposure in ERP, and the willingness to open up to difficult feelings in ACT. They need to feel fundamentally safer within themselves before they can effectively drop the rope in that tug-of-war with anxiety. CFT builds that safety.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Safety first. Now, beyond the anxiety, the shame, the self-criticism, we still need to address the deep roots of that perfectionistic rigidity itself, especially for the person with OCPD, the Ego-Syntonic type who sees their perfectionism as necessary, maybe even vital for survival or worthiness. This feels like it requires looking back, understanding the origins.
Absolutely. For those individuals where the perfectionism is deeply ingrained in their personality structure and seen as positive OCPD, or where it clearly stems from early life experiences, insight into the origins and functions of the perfectionism is often needed before they're willing or able to engage fully in behavioral change like ERP or even ACT's willingness. This is where therapies focusing on deeper patterns like schema therapy become relevant.
Schema therapy, what's the focus there?
Schema therapy, developed by Jeffrey Young, focuses on identifying and healing what are called early maladaptive schemas. These are deep, pervasive, self-defeating patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that typically originate in childhood or adolescence based on unmet core emotional needs.
And which schema is most relevant to perfectionism?
The big one is the unrelenting standards hypercriticalness schema. People with this schema feel intense pressure to meet extremely high, often internalized, standards for their behavior and performance, usually to avoid criticism. They believe they must constantly strive, be the best, keep everything perfect. This often manifests as perfectionism, rigid rules, preoccupation with time and efficiency, and difficulty relaxing or enjoying accomplishments.
Where does a schema like that come from?
It often originates in a childhood environment where love, approval, or acceptance from parents or significant others felt heavily conditional on achieving high standards or performing perfectly. The child learns implicitly, I am only loved, safe, worthy if I am perfect, successful, the best. Or perhaps they had highly critical or demanding caregivers. They internalize these external standards and the associated criticism, and it becomes a core part of their identity and how they operate in the world.
So, schema therapy helps connect the current perfectionism back to those early unmet needs and beliefs.
Yes. It helps the person understand the historical roots of their unrelenting standards. It validates the childhood origins of the schema. It makes sense you develop this pattern given your experiences, while also helping them see how this once adaptive coping mechanism is now causing significant problems in their adult life. Healing involves emotionally processing those early experiences and consciously working to challenge and modify the schema and develop healthier ways of meeting those underlying needs for acceptance and self-worth.
So, gaining that insight, understanding why they feel this compulsive need to be perfect can create the motivation and the emotional space needed to let go of those rigid demands. It provides the historical context that makes behavioral therapies like ERP feel less threatening or more meaningful.
Precisely. Schema therapy can provide the crucial why that helps unlock the willingness to change the how. And we absolutely cannot discuss deep-seated perfectionism, especially the kind rooted in unrelenting standards, without acknowledging its very strong, though often hidden, connection to trauma.
Trauma. How does trauma link to perfectionism?
In many cases, perfectionism is, at its core, an embedded trauma response. Think about it. If you grew up in a chaotic, unpredictable, critical, or unsafe environment, developing rigid control over the one thing you could control: your own behavior. Your performance, your appearance might have felt like the only way to survive, to gain approval, to avoid punishment, criticism, abandonment, or further harm.
So the perfectionism becomes a safety strategy. If I do everything perfectly, if I anticipate every need, if I never make a mistake, then I won't be judged, I won't be hurt, I won't be abandoned again.
Exactly. It's an attempt, often unconscious, to exert control over an inherently uncontrollable or threatening external world by trying to perfect the self.
Yeah.
The hypervigilance of trauma gets channeled into meticulousness and self-monitoring. The fear of judgment becomes an intense drive for flawlessness.
If trauma is fueling the perfectionism, then standard ERP or ACT might not be enough on their own. You need to address the underlying trauma directly.
That's often the case. This makes trauma-focused therapies, particularly EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, an incredibly valuable adjunct therapy within an integrated treatment plan. EMDR isn't typically used as a standalone treatment for the habit loop of OCD compulsions, but it's exceptionally effective for targeting and processing the specific traumatic memories, adverse life events, or shaming experiences that may be fueling the perfectionism, the anxiety, and the negative self-beliefs.
So how do EMDR and ERP work together then?
We often conceptualize it this way. EMDR helps to process the fuel. It desensitizes the emotional charge and negative cognitions associated with the disturbing past memories or triggers that are driving the perfectionistic engine. It takes the heat out of those early experiences. Once that underlying traumatic activation is reduced, the person is often much more capable of tolerating the distress involved in ERP. Then, ERP can come in more effectively to retrain the habit loop, breaking the cycle of obsessions and compulsions in the present. It's a powerful combination, addressing the historical roots and the current behavioral manifestation.
Working on the fuel and the engine simultaneously. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we've covered a lot of therapeutic ground: ERP, ACT, CFT, schema therapy, EMDR. It feels like we're moving from individual techniques towards a more holistic, integrated philosophy of healing. And this seems like the perfect place to introduce a metaphor that beautifully captures this shift away from flaw removal towards embracing imperfection. The Japanese art of Kintsugi.
Kintsugi, yes. The golden repair or golden joinery. It's such a profound and beautiful counter-narrative to the entire perfectionist mindset.
Explain it for listeners who might not be familiar. What is Kintsugi?
Kintsugi is the traditional Japanese art of repairing broken pottery. But instead of trying to hide the cracks to make the repair invisible, as we often do in the West, Kintsugi artisans mend the broken pieces using lacquer that is deliberately mixed or dusted with powdered precious metals, usually gold, but sometimes silver or platinum.
So the cracks are not only visible, they're highlighted, illuminated with gold.
Exactly. The core philosophy behind Kintsugi is that the object's history of breakage and repair is not something to be ashamed of or concealed. Instead, the damage and the mending are seen as integral parts of the object's story, making it unique, beautiful, and often more valuable because it has been broken and lovingly repaired. The scars are celebrated, not hidden.
That is such a radical departure from the perfectionist ideal, which sees any crack, any flaw as total failure, something that invalidates the entire object or the entire person.
It's a complete rebuttal, Kintsugi says. Your flaws, your mistakes, your anxieties, your history of trauma, your moments of falling apart, they are not your shame. They are part of your unique history. They're the places where the light gets in, the places where the gold goes. The goal isn't to become some perfect, unbroken, sterile vessel, which is often brittle and lifeless anyway. The goal is to become whole, to be real, to be golden, embracing the totality of your experience, including the breaks and the repairs. Stop trying to be perfect. Aim to be whole.
Be golden. I love that. So if we synthesize everything we've discussed, all these different therapies and this Kintsugi philosophy, what does the truly definitive, integrative framework, the stack of interventions that addresses the whole person, look like for healing deep-seated perfectionism or OCD?
It really needs to be multi-layered, acknowledging that we're complex systems. We can think of it levels. Level 1, insight and origin. This is the historical and foundational work. It involves schema therapy, perhaps psychodynamic exploration, and often EMDR for processing underlying trauma or adverse experiences. We need to understand the why. Where did these unrelenting standards or obsessive fears come from? We process the historical fuel.
Okay, level 1, understand the roots. What's next?
Level 2, safety and effect regulation. This is where compassion-focused therapy, CFT, comes in. We need to build internal resources of safeness, self-compassion, and emotional regulation before or alongside tackling the hardest behavioral work. We actively counteract the shame and self-criticism, creating a kinder internal environment. We build the emotional platform.
Level 2, build safety and compassion.
Level 3, motivation, meaning, and perspective. This is the domain of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. Here, we clarify the person's core values, their North Star, providing the motivation for change. We teach cognitive diffusion skills to help them unhook from unhelpful thoughts and gain perspective. We cultivate willingness, acceptance to experience discomfort. We change the relationship with internal experience.
Level 3, find meaning and change perspective with ACT, leading to
Level 4, action and behavior change. This is where the rubber meets the road with exposure and response prevention, ERP. Grounded in safety, CFT, and oriented by values, ACT, the person engages in the systematic behavioral work of confronting fears and resisting compulsions. This is where the inhibitory learning happens, where the brain gets retrained through direct experience. ERP becomes the committed action.
insight, safety, perspective, action. That covers the psychological layers, but what about the biological foundation?
Crucial point. We absolutely cannot ignore level 5, biological and lifestyle support. This is the essential platform upon which psychological change happens. For moderate to severe OCD, pharmacotherapy is often a necessary component. The first-line medications are typically high-dose serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, drugs like fluoxetine, sertraline, fluvoxamine, or sometimes the older tricyclic antidepressant clomipramine, which can be particularly potent for OCD.
And these medications help how?
They don't cure OCD, but they can significantly dial down the intensity of the obsessions and the urge to perform compulsions. They basically lower the volume of the anxiety enough for the person to be able to engage more effectively in the demanding work of ERP and ACT. For many, medication makes therapy possible or much more effective.
What if SSRIs aren't enough for those really tough treatment refractory cases?
For complex or treatment-resistant cases, psychiatrists might augment the SSRI, often with low doses of certain antipsychotic medications, which can help modulate dopamine and other neurotransmitter systems involved in these circuits. Beyond medication, there's the growing field of neuromodulation. Techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which uses magnetic pulses to stimulate specific brain regions, have shown promise for OCD by targeting those hyperactive brain loops. Deep brain stimulation, DBS, involving implanted electrodes, is a more invasive option reserved for the most severe, debilitating, and treatment-refractory cases. We're directly intervening at the hardware level of the brain circuits.
Hardware interventions. And alongside these clinical treatments, lifestyle must play a role too.
Absolutely. That's also part of level 5. We have to include holistic and lifestyle support. This involves things like nutritional psychiatry, paying attention to the gut-brain axis, perhaps incorporating anti-inflammatory foods, probiotics. Basic lifestyle factors are huge regulators of anxiety and mood. Vigorous exercise, consistent sleep hygiene, stress management techniques. Addressing the whole person means optimizing the biological platform through both clinical and lifestyle approaches. Every layer supports the next.
It's a truly comprehensive stack. Insight, safety, perspective, action, and biological support. Okay, this brings us inevitably to the great paradox we started with. The perfectionist's deep desire, maybe even demand, for the ultimate magic bullet. That single, perfect, maybe instantaneous cure, a sudden healing, or perhaps a sudden enlightenment experience like the Zen concepts of Satori or Kensho that will just wipe the slate clean and make them perfectly whole instantly.
Yes, and it's so important to address this directly because that very desire for the perfect, instantaneous, effortless cure is often itself a symptom of the underlying perfectionism and intolerance of process. It's the demand for 100% relief right now.
What does the actual clinical data say about just waiting for a miracle for spontaneous remission? Does OCD or severe perfectionism just go away on its own?
The data on that is pretty sobering, unfortunately. Spontaneous remission rates for chronic, moderate to severe OCD are generally very low. Studies often cite rates around 4%, maybe slightly higher in some specific populations, but it's certainly not the norm. This is typically a chronic condition if left untreated. It doesn't tend to just fade away magically over time if you simply wait long enough. Waiting for a cure isn't a viable strategy. It usually requires active, consistent engagement in treatment.
So hoping for a passive miracle cure is basically another form of avoidance fueled by the perfectionism itself.
Often, yes. Now that being said, there is a phenomena of sudden healing that is validated by clinical science. It's not a mystical event, but it can feel miraculous to the person experiencing it. It's the phenomenon of sudden gains in therapy.
Sudden gains, what are those?
Sudden gains are defined as large, rapid, and usually sustained improvements in symptoms that occur very quickly, often between just 1 or 2 therapy sessions, typically early on in a course of effective treatment like CBT or ERP. Someone might come in week after week making slow progress, and then suddenly, between session 4 and session 5, they report a massive drop in symptoms, a huge shift in perspective, and that improvement tends to stick. It feels like a switch flipped.
Wow, so sudden improvement can happen, but it's not passive, it happens within therapy.
Exactly. These sudden gains aren't passive miracles that happen out of the blue. Research suggests they are often preceded by a significant cognitive shift that occurs right before the gain. It's like the patient had this internal cognitive click, where they successfully challenge and fundamentally correct a core inaccurate belief or maladaptive thought pattern. Maybe they finally internalize, my thoughts are just thoughts, or I don't have to be 100% certain, or I can tolerate this anxiety. And that cognitive breakthrough seems to unlock the rapid behavioral change. It's the effect of the consistent hard work paying off in a concentrated way, not an escape from the work.
So the miracle is earned through effort, not granted by grace alone. That makes sense. What about the spiritual angle, though? People hear about Zen enlightenment, Satori, Kensho, these moments of profound insight. Do they cure psychological problems like OCD?
That's a common misconception. While spiritual insights can be profoundly meaningful and change one's relationship to suffering, they don't typically function as a cure for clinical disorders in the way we think of a cure. In fact, there are famous accounts of highly regarded Zen masters like Hakuin Kaku, who experienced profound enlightenment, Satori, but continue to struggle significantly with what sounds very much like severe anxiety, panic attacks, and phobias afterwards.
So enlightenment didn't wipe away his anxiety?
Apparently not. His enlightenment didn't erase the fear or the difficult internal states. Rather, it likely recontextualized them. He realized that his core self, his fundamental nature, was untouched by the anxiety, even when it was present. The suffering associated with the anxiety might have decreased dramatically because he stopped identifying with it or fighting it, but the underlying vulnerability might have remained. It changes the relationship to the problem, much like ACT aims to do, rather than eliminating the problem itself.
That's a crucial distinction, and it leads perfectly into a really important warning, especially for the highly motivated, perhaps perfectionistic listener who hears about mindfulness and Zen and decides to pursue spiritual practice as a potential solution. There's a trap there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely, a huge one. We call it the meditation trap or spiritual compulsivity. Because a person with strong perfectionistic or obsessive tendencies is almost guaranteed, without careful guidance, to turn spiritual or contemplative practice into a new set of rigid rules and standards to be perfected.
How does that look?
It becomes a new compulsion, a new way to seek that elusive 100% control, this time over their mind or their spiritual progress. They start worrying intensely about doing meditation right. Is my posture perfect? Am I breathing correctly? Why can't I stop thinking? Am I having the right kind of insights? They might compulsively read spiritual texts, looking for the perfect technique or the final answer that will solve their distracting thoughts or their anxiety. It just leads to more thinking, and more thinking, more striving, more judgment, more frustration about how to be the perfect meditator.
So it's the same old cognitive pitfall, the same struggle for control, just dressed up in spiritual robes.
Exactly the same pattern. They turn a practice designed to foster acceptance and non-striving into another domain for perfectionistic striving and self-criticism.
So what is the authentic Zen response to that trap? If the perfectionist is sitting in meditation, maybe feeling panic because they're having intrusive thoughts or their mind won't quiet down and they feel like they're failing at meditating, what's the actual instruction?
The truly profound and often challenging Zen response is that the fear, the distraction, the confusion, the bad thoughts, that is the point. That is the meditation right there. The very arising of that difficulty is the opportunity for practice. The core falsehood-fueling perfectionism is the deeply ingrained belief that you have to keep thinking, keep analyzing, keep fixing, keep controlling your way to the correct answer or the right state of mind in order to finally be okay.
So the instruction isn't to try harder to clear the mind.
No. The instruction is usually something like, notice the thinking, notice the fear, acknowledge its presence without judgment, and then gently return your attention to something simple and tangible in the present moment. Often the physical sensation of the breath entering and leaving the body, or the sounds in the room, or the feeling of your body sitting. Each time you notice you're caught in thought or struggle, you just gently return. That return, that simple, non-judgmental redirection of attention back to raw sensory experience is the practice. It's a direct, physical act of faith against the mental falsehood that says you have to keep thinking and struggling to get things right. You're practicing letting go over and over.
Letting go, not fixing. That feels like the core message running through everything we've discussed. And this seems like the perfect moment to bring in those classic Zen parables that illustrate this final breakthrough, this shift from intellectual struggle to simple acceptance, that Kensho or Satori moment. The story of the professor and the overflowing teacup feels particularly relevant for the hyper-intellectual perfectionist who's trying to think their way out of the problem.
Ah yes, Nanin and the Professor. A wonderful story. So the tale goes that a very learned university professor, brilliant, famous, probably quite proud of his intellect, a total perfectionist who has read and analyzed every philosophical and spiritual text he could find, goes to visit an old renowned Zen master named Nanin, seeking definitive answers about enlightenment.
He arrives ready to impress the master with his knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. The professor immediately starts talking, lecturing Nanin about his own extensive studies, his complex theories about the nature of reality, his intricate speculations about what Zen really is, how he has intellectually mapped out the void. He just goes on, complete liberal of his own ideas and interpretations.
He's so full of himself, he can't actually learn anything new. His cup is already full.
Precisely. And the Zen master, Nanin, just listens patiently, nodding silently. Then he quietly begins to serve the professor tea. He pours tea into the professor's cup and fills it right to the brim. And then he just keeps pouring.
Keeps pouring even when it's full.
Yes. The tea overflows the cup, spills onto the saucer, runs all over the table, soaking the professor's fine robes. The professor, initially confused, then alarmed, finally leaps up shouting, "Stop! Stop! It's overfull! Can't you see? No more will go in."
And what does the master say?
Nanin stops pouring, looks calmly at the agitated professor, and says simply, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. You are too full of your ideas about how things should be, too full of your intellectual understanding, too full of your quest for the perfect answer. How can I possibly show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?"
Wow. You have to let go of what you think you know, let go of the need to have it all figured out before you can actually experience something new.
That's the essence of it. That moment of realizing your intellectual frameworks, your complex analyses, your perfectionistic plans are actually blocking you from direct experience. That can be a Satori moment. It's the sudden realization that maybe, just maybe, the 80-slide PowerPoint deck you've been agonizing over, the obsessive concern with the footnote formatting, the constant analytical rumination about whether you're good enough, maybe it's all just overflowing tea. Maybe it's entirely irrelevant to the core task of actually living, connecting, or doing what matters. You're so full of the idea of how things should be, you can't see or engage with how they actually are.
My cup is overflowing with pivot table. Okay, I get it. Empty the cup. So the ultimate answer, the miracle cure the perfectionist is seeking, isn't found in more complexity, more analysis, more striving.
No. Often, the deepest breakthroughs come through embracing radical simplicity. It's beautifully captured in that simple, direct, almost mundane paradox from another Zen master, Bankai. When people kept asking him about his spiritual miracles and powers, he reportedly replied, "My miracle is this. When I feel hungry, I eat. And when I feel thirsty, I drink."
That's it. That's the miracle. Eating when you're hungry.
That's it. The miracle isn't some supernatural feat. It's the ability to respond simply, directly, and appropriately to the reality of the present moment, without getting lost in complex mental filters, judgments, or perfectionistic requirements. For the perfectionist agonizing over the report, the equivalent miracle might be the sudden, simple realization, wait, my boss, my client, my team, they just need the key number from page 3.
Yeah.
They don't actually care about the kerning on the subheader in Appendix B or the 80-slide deck I stayed up all night perfecting.
The miracle is realizing what's actually needed versus what the perfectionistic mind demands.
Exactly. The true miracle is often just simple, committed action, aligned with reality and values, stripped bare of all the unnecessary mental baggage and perfectionistic striving. It's sending the email that's good enough. It's eating when you're hungry. It's connecting with someone instead of polishing a footnote. The healing isn't a sudden, perfect cure. It's the gradual, radical, sometimes difficult, but ultimately joyful embrace of good enough. It's dropping the rope and just walking forward.
So we've really come full circle, haven't we? Back to that initial idea. The path to healing, the path to feeling better, isn't found in intensifying the pursuit of a perfected self or a flawless internal state. It's actually found in the courageous abandonment of that quest entirely.
That's the radical paradigm shift required. It's moving your focus from trying desperately to control and perfect the content of your internal world, those random, often noisy, sometimes scary thoughts and feelings, to focusing instead on the context of your life, clarifying your values, and taking committed actions, however imperfectly, in the direction of those values. You shift from fixing the internal weather to driving the bus.
Changing your relationship to the internal world, rather than changing the world itself.
Precisely. And if we were to leave you, the listener, with one final thought, something to really mull over that builds on this whole theme of uncertainty and letting go, perhaps it's this.
Okay.
The realization that truly frees the mind from the relentless, exhausting grip of perfectionism isn't achieving 100% certainty or control. It's realizing you don't need to be 100% sure. You just need to be 100% willing. Willing to be uncertain, willing to feel anxious, willing to make mistakes, willing to be imperfect.
Willingness, not certainty.
Yes. The true enlightenment, if you want to call it that, isn't some blissed out state free of all problems. It's simply the end of the exhausting, futile war against yourself. It's dropping the rope. So the question we leave you with is, what committed action, however small, however imperfect, will you take today in service of your values, even with those noisy, critical passengers still on the bus?